Hi everyone. Today we'll be looking at the issues of Indian removal, territorial expansion, and finally the war against Mexico in the mid-19th century. Under the Indian Intercourse Act of 1790, passed during George Washington's time as president, Native Americans had been told by the federal government that if they cooperated with, rather than opposed, the United States, their future did not have to be a hopeless one. Further, they were informed that if they made changes in their lives to conform more to the so-called ways of the white man, such as becoming small farmers and private landholders, full citizenship rights in the future may be a possibility. If there was one group of Native people who truly embraced the promises made by the federal government, it was the Cherokee Nation. This map shows the region of the country claimed by the Cherokee. They were most densely concentrated in the region of northern Georgia and parts of northern Alabama. In 1794, they formed and the United States recognized what was known as the Cherokee Republic. In 1827, they adopted a written constitution with 3 branches of government: legislative, judicial, and executive, to mirror that of the United States government. They had converted Cherokee to a written language and even formed their own newspaper, which we have a copy of here from 1828, known as the Cherokee Phoenix. In its pages, people could learn both English and Cherokee. First, a news story would be printed in English, and right beneath it, the same article would appear in Cherokee. The National Council was the name given to the Cherokee legislature. In 1828, it elected the man we see in this photograph, John Ross, as chief, a position he would hold through the Civil War in the 1860s. He was the son of a Cherokee mother and a Scottish father. To look at him walking down the streets of an American city, one would likely never guess his ancestry, much less that he was the chief of the Cherokee Nation. He looked more like a member of the United States Congress, based on his style of dress and physical appearance. And this goes to make the point of just how much, by the early decades of the 19th century, the Cherokee had acclimated themselves to American society. Despite the extent to which they had lived up to the letter of the Indian Intercourse Act and done virtually all the things the federal government asked of them, the Cherokee, especially after the War of 1812, faced increasing pressure and harassment from the state of Georgia to sell off their ancestral lands. Greatly offended, the Cherokee always refused and pointed to their treaties with the federal government that recognized their sovereignty. The problem was that by the time John Ross became chief in 1828, the national government was no longer a reliable ally in disputes with the states over Indian lands, and Americans' views of Indians overall were changing, and not for the better. Andrew Jackson was president, and he made Indian removal the top priority of his administration even before he launched his assault on the Second Bank of the United States. The problem with Indians by the late 1820s and early 1830s, even so-called civilized tribes like the Cherokee, was that they occupied lands desired by white men. Indians did not vote for Andrew Jackson, but the white men of states like Georgia did, and the old general, famous for his exploits at killing Indians prior to becoming president, did not intend to disappoint his constituents. At his direction, in 1830, Congress passed what became known as the Indian Removal Act, which we see a portrait of here. The bill called for the evacuation of tribes from the Southeast and the Midwest to a designated area known as Indian Territory. There was no portion of the bill, as with the earlier Indian Intercourse Act, that even hinted at citizenship rights for Indians, no matter what they did to accommodate the government. The fact was that by the 1830s, most Americans no longer imagined a permanent place for Indians in the country's future, and certainly not one where they could coexist with whites on terms of equality. 18th century Enlightenment notions of progress, based on the concept that environment shaped human conditions of advancement, suggested that Indians could move from so-called savagery to civilization over time, if they adopted the ways of European culture. By the 1820s and 1830s, pseudo-scientific notions of racial superiority and inferiority that were unchanging, inherent, and permanent had largely replaced Enlightenment ideas about race. The white men of Georgia, the President of the United States, and most members of Congress did not accept the Cherokee as a civilized tribe. They were members of an inferior race of human beings who faced decline and even annihilation so long as they lived in the vicinity of a supposedly superior Anglo-Saxon or white race, as they did in the United States. When it came to promoting the idea of Indian removal, Andrew Jackson surprised some by making his appeal on professed humanitarian grounds, portraying himself as he appears in this political cartoon of the period, as the great white father of the Indians. Citing the pseudoscience of the day, which suggested that races deemed inferior could never exist long-term in a state of freedom next to a superior white race and culture without fading or even disappearing, the president argued that removal was the only guaranteed way of making sure there were Indians in North America, anywhere. The country was not going to stop growing. Indians were in the way, and if humanitarians wanted to save any of them, they had to be removed west, beyond the reach of white settlement. This was the idea of Indian Territory. The Cherokee faced long odds when it came to trying to hold on to their ancestral lands, but they did not give up or give in. Led by Chief John Ross, they took their grievances against the state of Georgia all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1831's Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, which we have in our original publication of here. And the following year, in 1832, with the case Worcester v. Georgia. In the first, the court declared the Cherokee to be what it called a domestic dependent nation, legally independent and in control of its own affairs, but dependent upon the federal government for its sovereignty. In the 1832 case, the court expanded its rulings in favor of the Cherokee, saying that the state laws of Georgia did not apply to them, and that only the federal government had jurisdiction in Indian lands by way of signing treaties with them. Sadly, even the backing of the highest court could not save the Cherokee from removal. Jackson and his successors simply refused to enforce the court's orders, in clear and blatant violation of the Constitution and its system of checks and balances. This map shows the route the Cherokee were sent upon to Indian Territory in the west, what later became Oklahoma. When it occurred, Andrew Jackson was no longer president. It was his immediate successor, Martin Van Buren of New York, the nation's 8th president, who we see here, that gave the orders to force the Cherokee upon the infamous Trail of Tears between 1837 and 1838. The series of forced relocations exposed thousands of Cherokee to the elements, hunger, and starvation along the way. Here we have a famous painting depicting the tragedy and the crime. Some 4,000 died, mostly elderly, small children, and babies. Often forgotten, or at least acknowledged in the horrific story of Indian removal, is the fact that it was not just the Cherokee that faced the loss of their ancestral homes. As this map indicates, many groups faced the same fate, among them the Sacs, Fox, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole Indians. The sad narrative of Native America was far from over. In the region of northern Mexico called Tejas, there was also a problem with Indians, one that the newly independent country was perplexed about. Mexico had finally gained its independence from Spain in 1821, after a bloody and costly struggle of many years. In the immediate decades that followed, the country struggled economically and politically to consolidate its independence into a stable government capable of managing the new nation's affairs. One of its biggest problems was the northern provinces, like Tejas, far away from the capital at Mexico City. Their distance and relative lack of population made these areas extremely difficult to defend. But Mexico's northern provinces were also the main site of its horse and cattle production, meaning assets that the country could ill afford to lose. The lack of security and rich targets places like Tejas presented made them the focus in the 1830s and 1840s especially of seemingly countless raids by mobile Indian groups such as the Comanche, represented in this illustration, and others like the Apaches and Navajos. Because it could not afford to man and fund the defense of Tejas, The government in Mexico City made the fateful decision in 1823 to begin allowing white American settlement into the province. The hope was that the Americans would provide a buffer zone of security against the constant threat of Indian raiding. Instead, Mexico inherited more problems. The only initial requirements were that settlers become Mexican citizens and that they convert to Catholicism. While some of the earliest Americans to move to the place they would call Texas met these requirements, like Stephen F. Austin, who we see here, most simply flooded into the region and completely ignored the laws of the government in Mexico City. Year after year, from the early 1820s into the 1830s, as we get an idea of from this illustration, white settlers, mostly from the southern United States, continued to pour into Texas. Much to the chagrin of the Mexican government, the settlers also, as this sketch shows, tended to bring their slaves with them. Mexico had outlawed slavery upon achieving its independence from Spain in 1821. In 1829, it explicitly outlawed slavery in Texas, but because the government had no ability to enforce the laws it passed, the Americans in Texas simply ignored it and kept coming. The next year, in 1830, a law was passed banning any further American settlement into Texas. It did not matter. Mexico had opened a floodgate it would never be able to close. When Mexico adopted a constitution in 1836 that stripped the states of their autonomy and centralized power in Mexico City, Texas was one of many provinces that erupted in revolt against the government. A few even tried to form new independent republics within Mexico, but the only one that succeeded was Texas. The rebellion did not begin well, however. The Mexican president, who we see here, Antonio Lopez de Santana, a career military officer and general, was determined to make an example of the Americanos in Texas. In the early months of 1836, he headed north. As we see in this illustration, on March 6th, his forces attacked at the Alamo, capturing and then killing all of the fort's nearly 200 defenders, including legendary figures like Sam Bowie and Davy Crockett, seen in this image, swinging his rifle at a Mexican soldier. Just a few weeks later, at a place called Goliad, depicted here, the Americans suffered an even greater defeat and faced a bloodier massacre as all 342 defenders were executed after they had surrendered, an event portrayed in this sketch. But on the 21st of April, Sam Houston and what was known as the Texian Army caught up with Santana, surprising him at a place called San Jacinto. Here we have an image of the battle. Despite being outnumbered, the Americans who attacked unexpectedly late in the afternoon completely routed Santana's forces and captured the general himself, even as he tried to escape in a common private's uniform. As this famous painting shows, the Mexican president was brought before Houston and forced to sign documents recognizing Texan independence, or face execution. Santana made the obvious choice and signed the papers. Here we have an actual photograph of Sam Houston, taken toward the end of his life. Reaction back in Mexico City was swift, as the central government removed the disgraced Santana as president and refused to recognize the so-called treaties of Velasco he had signed under duress. For the next 9 years, Texas existed as the Lone Star Republic from 1836 to 1845, when it was annexed by the United States. The only question was why it took nearly a decade for Texas to be admitted to the Union. The delay had to do primarily with concerns over slavery and the balance of political power between free and slave states. Because of Texas's size, many politicians feared it would be carved up into multiple slave states. To make a long story short, Texas was too hot a political potato to play with in 1836. But nearly a decade later, things had changed. By the middle of the 1840s, with Indians removed from the Southeast and Midwest, and Americans pouring into the West, the general appetite of the country for territorial expansion was again peaking. It became the dominant theme of the 1844 presidential election. And in 1845, a journalist, John L. O'Sullivan, who we have here in this sketch, coined the phrase that captured the national mood of the time: manifest destiny. It was in commenting on the annexation of Texas that O'Sullivan first coined the phrase manifest destiny to describe the process of American expansion. He used the expression to criticize other nations for attempting to interfere with what he called a natural process. England, for example, had tried to prevent Texas annexation to the United States. Other nations had intruded, O'Sullivan said, for the avowed object of thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness, and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Texas should be absorbed by the United States as part of the fulfillment of what O'Sullivan called the general law, which was sending a rapidly increasing American population westward. California would probably soon follow Texas within the American orbit. This painting captured the spirit of manifest destiny and much of its meaning. As O'Sullivan explained in relation to Texas, the Anglo-Saxon foot is already on its borders. The advance guard of the irresistible army of Anglo-Saxon emigration has begun to pour down upon it, armed with the plow and the rifle, and marking its trail with schools and colleges, courts and representative halls, mills and meeting houses. There was to be no balance of power on the American continent, O'Sullivan insisted. Spanish America had demonstrated no ability for growth. Canada, he predicted, would break away from England to be annexed by the United States. The country would expand by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. In his last official act before leaving office in early March 1845, President John Tyler, who we see in this painting, signed a House bill authorizing Texas annexation. By the end of the year, it became the 28th state in the Union. Use of the term Anglo-Saxon to describe white Americans was rare prior to the middle of the 1830s. But after this point, and well into the 1840s, it became commonplace. The catalyst in the overt adoption of a racial Anglo-Saxonism was the meeting of Americans and Mexicans in the Southwest, the Texas Revolution, and the war with Mexico. In confronting the Mexicans, the Americans clearly formulated the idea of themselves as an Anglo-Saxon race. By the 1830s, Americans were eagerly grasping at reasons for their own success and for the failure of others. Although the white Americans of the Jacksonian era wanted personal success and wealth, they also wanted a clear conscience. If the United States was to remain in the minds of its people a nation divinely ordained for great deeds, then the fault for the suffering inflicted in the rise to power and prosperity had to lie elsewhere. White Americans could rest easier if the sufferings of other races could be blamed on racial weakness rather than on whites' relentless search for wealth and power. In the 1830s and 1840s, when it became obvious that American and Mexican interests were incompatible and that the Mexicans would suffer, innate weaknesses were found in the Mexicans. Americans, it was argued, were not to be blamed for forcibly taking the northern provinces of Mexico, for Mexicans, like Indians, were unable to make proper use of the land. The Mexicans had failed because they were a mixed, inferior race with considerable Indian and some black blood. The world would benefit if a superior race shaped the future of the Southwest. By the time of the Mexican War, America had placed the Mexicans firmly within the rapidly emerging hierarchy of superior and inferior races. While the Anglo-Saxons were depicted as the purest of the pure, the finest Caucasians, the Mexicans who stood in the way of southwestern expansion were depicted as a mongrel race, adulterated by extensive intermarriage with an inferior Indian race. The American dismissal of the Mexicans as an inferior, largely Indian race did not pass unnoticed in Mexico. Mexican ministers in the United States warned their government that the Americans considered them an inferior people. The Mexicans realized both that their neighbors to the north were likely to invade their northern provinces and that they would claim that this was justified because they could make better use of the lands. Mexicans who served as diplomatic representatives in the United States were shocked at the rabid anti-Mexican attitudes and the fact that they were lumped together with Indians and blacks. Politicians in the United States for some time had taken a keen interest in Mexico's trouble with Indians. Here we have another depiction of the Comanche warriors of the period. Throughout the late 1830s and early 1840s, editors, diplomats, congressmen, and administration officials invoked the country's inability to control Indians in order to denigrate Mexico's claims to its northern territories, first in Texas and later across the whole of the Mexican North. These fateful attitudes reached their logical conclusion in 1846, when the United States invaded Mexico and exploited the tensions and tragedies of the ongoing war with Comanches, Apaches, and Navajos to conquer the North and to frame the dismemberment of Mexico as an act of national salvation. What we know as the Mexican War, fought between 1846 and 1848, reshaped North American boundaries for all its peoples. For President James Knox Polk, who we have in this photograph, the war against Mexico started out as an attempt to buy California. Polk dispatched an emissary to Mexico offering to purchase the region, but the Mexican government refused to negotiate. By the spring of 1846, Polk was planning for military action. In April, American soldiers under General Zachary Taylor, who we have here, moved into the region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, land claimed by both countries on the disputed border between Texas and Mexico. This political cartoon of the time captured the moment. The action made conflict with Mexican forces inevitable. On April 26, 1846, U.S. dragoons were attacked by Mexican cavalry in an incident that became known as the Thornton Affair, captured in this sketch. General Taylor and American forces defended Fort Texas from a Mexican siege in the first week of May, while news of the outbreak of hostilities made its way back to Washington. Here we have an illustration of the defense of Fort Texas. On May 8th, Taylor defeated the Mexican army at what became known as the Battle of Palo Alto, depicted here. The next day, President Polk received Taylor's message. With the knowledge that hostilities had commenced on land in dispute between the two countries, Polk went before Congress and lied, claiming that the Mexicans had shed blood upon American soil and called for a declaration of war. The Mexican War was the first American conflict to be fought primarily on foreign soil, and the first in which American troops occupied a foreign capital. Inspired by the expansionist fervor of Manifest Destiny Most Americans supported the war, but a significant minority in the North dissented, fearing that the Polk administration's real aim was to acquire new land for the expansion of slavery. More than 60,000 volunteers enlisted and did most of the fighting. As U.S. troops penetrated northern Mexico, they encountered an alien terrain: people, religion, language, and culture. No earlier American army had experienced anything quite like this. The soldiers' responses to what they encountered, as exhibited in letters, diaries, and contemporary newspapers like this one, clearly reflect the temper of the times throughout the United States. American soldiers during the war came into frequent contact with the civilian population of Mexico. One reason was that the Army's long-term camps during the conflict were always in or near to Mexican towns and villages. The soldiers soon got first-hand exposure to the people and their way of life. Because the Army contracted locally for food and various other supplies, there was a considerable amount of interaction with local businessmen. And since the camps were usually not particularly restricted, local peddlers and food vendors plied their wares to the men. It was at this level that many of the Americans met the Mexican people. The relationship seldom approached anything resembling friendship, as the soldiers seemed to regard the Mexicans with whom they dealt as treacherous devils. On a general level, the American soldiers regarded the Mexican people as being of a lower racial order. One thing that particularly bothered them was the amount of miscegenation in Mexican society. They came from a country where interracial marriages were, with rare exception, strictly taboo. Early Spanish settlers in Mexico had few qualms about taking darker-skinned mates, usually Indians, so that by the 1840s, every hue and color, from white to brown to black, comprised the Mexican population. This in turn led to the American characterization of the Mexican people as a so-called mongrel race. The conditions of abject poverty in which many Mexicans lived reinforced their lowly image in American eyes. Of course, not every American soldier harbored such resentful feelings toward the Mexican people, but scarcely any regarded them as equals. Taken as a group, the American soldiers of the late 1840s were the embodiment of the concept of manifest destiny. They were unwilling to allow anything to stand in the way of their nation's course to greatness. They regarded all human beings with darker skins as being on a lower level of human evolution than themselves. Many gave evidence of this in their frequent comparisons of the Mexican peasants with Indians of the American West and black slaves of the American South. This debasement of the Mexicans served a military purpose, in that the troops had less difficulty in taking the lives of enemy soldiers if they considered them to be subhuman. This pattern of violence was not always restricted to the battlefields, as soldiers with too much free time between campaigns often alleviated the boredom of camp life by committing crimes of varying magnitude against the civilian population of Mexico, including everything from simple petty theft to rape. Combat in the Mexican War took place on three fronts. In July 1846, as we see depicted in this painting from the time, the U.S. Navy sailed into Monterey and San Francisco harbors and raised the American flag. Around the same time, 1,600 American troops under General Stephen W. Kearny, who we have here, occupied Santa Fe, New Mexico, without resistance before setting out to take control of Southern California. The bulk of the fighting occurred in central Mexico. In February 1847, General Zachary Taylor defeated Mexican forces under the command, once again, of Antonio Lopez de Santana at the Battle of Buena Vista, which we have a couple of illustrations of here. When the Mexican government still refused to negotiate, Polk ordered American forces under General Winfield Scott, captured in this photograph, to march inland from the port of Veracruz toward Mexico City. Scott's troops routed the Mexican defenders and in September occupied the country's capital, an event captured in these illustrations. In February 1848, the U.S. and Mexican governments agreed to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which confirmed the annexation of Texas and ceded California and present-day New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah to the United States. In exchange, the Polk administration agreed to pay the Mexican government $15 million. This is the final page of the treaty. The territories taken from Mexico became known collectively as the Mexican Cession. With the end of the war, the United States absorbed 500,000 square miles of Mexico's lands, 1/3 of the nation's total area, reflected on this map. The Mexican War is only a footnote in most Americans' historical memory. Unlike other wars, few public monuments celebrate the conflict. Mexicans, however, regard the war, or the dismemberment, as they refer to it, as a central event of their national history and a source of continued resentment over a century and a half since it was fought. After the war, and even during the conflict, bitter political disputes erupted in Congress over the annexation of Mexican territory. However, the arguments focused not so much on the acquisition of land, but on the potential incorporation of large numbers of Mexican people into the American Union. Although abolitionists and some Whigs at first opposed any expansion because it involved extending slavery, and though some Southerners eventually opposed expansion because they feared free areas entering the Union, most Americans expected and wanted the acquisition of Mexico's sparsely populated northern territories. Also, many on both sides of the political argument believed that the rest of Mexico was eventually destined to be dominated by the American Anglo-Saxon race. When writing or talking of the indefinite future, rather than the immediate political destiny of Mexico, publicists and politicians argued in simplistic terms of supplanting inferior Mexicans with superior Anglo-Saxons, ignoring the practical problems of the nature of American rule over adjacent areas. They argued that God was arranging for an American victory over Mexico in the same manner He'd provided for the vast increase in American power, the disappearance of the Indians, and earlier victories over England. Though God might be, as they imagined it, guiding Americans to the conquest of Mexico, He had not provided a detailed plan for American rule over the Mexican people. American victories in the Mexican War meant that there had to be a practical discussion of the future relationship of the Mexicans to the American federal system. The prophecies of a manifest destiny sweeping Americans onward over ever greater areas appeared to be coming true with remarkable speed as American armies pressed on into Mexico. To some, the northern provinces now seemed only the beginning. All of Mexico was there for the taking, and it was assumed that the American people, American energy, and American capital could quickly transform the whole region. The stumbling block was the Mexican people. From the very beginning of the war, the Whigs had a great deal of support from Democrats in resisting the acquisition of any heavily populated Mexican areas. The Whigs were, of course, fearful that expansion in the Southwest would mean the extension of slavery, but they also believed that Mexico represented a potential threat to American democratic institutions. They could not accept the idea of the United States as a colonial power in the region, because that would endanger the Republican form of government. Most importantly, Whigs believed that the American political system would be ruined by the participation of millions of supposedly inferior Mexican citizens. Education was no solution, for most Americans by the 1840s believed in innate, not simply environmental, inferiority. Congressional opposition to the possibility of incorporating Mexican people into the Union had been expressed even before the war started. Generally, the Whigs wanted caution and gradualism in expansion, where Democrats were ready for swift action. But neither party wanted other races to participate in the American government. As one congressman from Indiana put it, "I do not want any mixed races in our union, nor men of any color except white, unless they be slaves. Certainly not as voters or legislators." Whatever the likelihood of replacing Mexicans with Anglo-Saxons in the future, most Americans realized that in practical terms, the annexation of the whole of Mexico would mean either that 8 million Mexicans would become American citizens, or that they would be ruled as colonial subjects. Most of the arguments claiming that large areas of Mexico could safely be annexed were based on the twin assumptions that the largely Indian Mexicans would fade away, and that the American Anglo-Saxons were destined to outbreed the whole world. In the end, the United States settled in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo for a Rio Grande boundary with Mexico and the acquisition of both the New Mexico and California territories. This proved to be the most acceptable resolution for most Americans because it obtained the largest possible area from Mexico with the least number of Mexicans. It was not finally the problem of the expansion of slavery that prevented the U.S. from taking more or even all of Mexico in 1848, but rather fears of the impact that racial amalgamation and imperial dominion would have on American democratic institutions. While Whigs attacked the treaty for the population it brought into the country, Democrats claimed victory for taking large tracts of relatively unpopulated territory from Mexico. As one paper of the time put it, the U.S. had not obtained the best boundary, but all the territory of value we can get without taking the people. In Congress, once the Mexican War was underway, contention over how much, if any, of Mexico should be annexed swiftly spilled over into dispute whether slaveholders should be barred from any of the annexed territory. The question blew up on August 8, 1846, when President Polk asked Congress for a $2 million appropriation to conduct negotiations with Mexico. In response, a Northern Democrat, captured in this photograph, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, moved that slavery be banned in any territory negotiated from Mexico. The House passed Polk's appropriation bill with Wilmot's proviso attached, 85-79. Southerners voted almost unanimously against. Northerners almost unanimously for making lands acquired from Mexico off limits to slaveholders. Wilmot's concern was slave power impositions on whites from the North. He said he had no morbid sympathy for the slave. What he wanted was a white man's Mecca, where my own race and own color can live without the disgrace of association with Negro slavery. Although Wilmot's measure was defeated in the Senate, it was repeatedly reintroduced by members of the anti-slavery wing of the Democratic Party in the North. Literally every time discussion turned to the cession of Mexican lands. Heated debates erupted between Northerners and Southerners in both the House and the Senate every time the subject was broached. So the war that was supposed to solidify and grow the Union and add to its prosperity ended up reopening the one subject that threatened its dissolution, the issue of slavery in the territories. Okay, that does it for today. Next time we'll start talking about the growth of slavery, cotton, and the rise of radical abolition in the North in the antebellum period.